Greetings, Michael.
Hello, Carl. How are you today?
I'm fantastic. Fantastic.
Fantastic. Fantastic's pretty fantastic.
Yeah, it's hard not to be. We had this big fire here. 5,000 people had to be evacuated, and it started raining like crazy today. So that's why we're all fantastic. Yeah, happy, rain, good.
And for people who aren't familiar, where's here for you?
Park City, Utah. Yeah, the West is generally on fire, and we've avoided it right around here, but just literally right over the ridge I'm looking out the window at, there was it ended up being like 500 acres, but it was super close to 5,000 homes.
Wow.
So anyway, that's why we're fantastic, because it's raining today. And normally when we get rain here, we're like, oh, it's kind of sad, but today rain is good. So
rain is good.
This reminds me a little bit of this conversation I had recently. I had breakfast with a relatively young, probably 2 years out financial planner. And I consider one of the best, sharpest, smartest financial planners I've ever met, and especially at her age. And
so young up and coming superstar.
Yeah. And she brought up this fear. And it's interesting. I've heard this hundreds of times. And since the conversation, it's come up in probably 3 or 4 different podcasts that I've done.
Okay.
This fear, almost a paralyzing fear around being wrong. Right? This in our planning, right? This need to be like, well, what if I'm wrong? What if the plan doesn't work out the way it's supposed to? What if the portfolio needs to be adjusted? What if the goals aren't what we thought they were going to be? And even as I'm listing those, to me, I've realized that something has flipped in my head where I've realized that of course, the plan isn't going to work out the way it's supposed to, or the way you planned. You know what I mean? Like, of course it's not going to. And I've just accepted that doing real financial planning means living in wrongness. And the goal is to be a little bit more right each day, right? It's not about being precisely correct today. It's about being less wrong tomorrow. But in accepting that, you have to accept, if we could scale, like if there was a scale of wrongness, like you implied in the idea that you're going to be a little less wrong tomorrow is that you're wrong today, right? And if there was a scale, like you're 10 wrong today and tomorrow you want to be 9.5 wrong. That means we have to accept that we're wrong. So first question is, that I'd like to talk about is, how does it feel to live in wrongness as part of your job? How do you deal with that? And second would be, how do we communicate that with clients? Because the person next door, the joker down the street, is going to sell a list of certainty. Prospective clients coming in your door and their door, they're going to tell them how certain they are, even though we know that's a myth. They're going to sell certainty. So how do you communicate with clients that, look, it's course corrections, it's less wrong? So those are the 2 questions. How have you approached? Because you're a very precise, like, I'm going to analyze. I think you have a reputation of analyzing things, that you do studies and you have
research. We try not to put the research in quotes.
You have abacuses.
Like, think of his actual research, but yes.
You have law.
For those who can't see, Carl is air quoting right now.
You have large calculators and big computers. How do you deal with the fact that, because sorry, this is a long-winded intro, but I've only recently discovered that it's not an or, it's an and. What I mean by that is, like, we are going to do the best we possibly can to be exactly right on this plan. And we know we're wrong. That requires, like, that's a lot of cognitive dissonance to hold 2 competing truths in your head at the same time.
Well, and frankly, when I'm wearing my hat as a professional, like, wrong often means sued and liable. So I have to admit, maybe it's even just a framing, because I don't disagree with the principle you're putting forth here, right? I think we all get, when we do the financial planning projection that says they're going to have $2.713 million in 47.2 years, it's probably not going to be exactly that. So, like, I get it. I think we get it at that level. I will admit, just like the the inherent nature of describing it as like wrongness and how wrong we are, yeah, that sort of makes me like really antsy straight out of the gate of like, I get sued when I'm wrong. I mean, yes, I realize no one's going to sue me because it wasn't exactly $2.713 million in 47.2 years, but like starting out with the client, like, let me tell you how wrong we're going to be. That's tough for me. Is that out of the gate?
You know, because you've done these experiments, like all we have to do is change inflation from 3 to 2.5 or 3.5 or whatever. Like, and we see these wild swings. Like, we know that planning is about narrowing in the range of outcomes over time, and that is really like real planning in conditions of complexity, which is what we humans and markets are. Real planning is indeed about being less wrong each day. And so we can phrase that differently. I'm not saying you walk into clients and say, hey, I'm super wrong today. Like, I'm not saying that. That's what I'm saying is we can talk about the communication. But internally, what we know is if we want to frame it differently, it's about course corrections, right? It's about the ongoing process of planning. It's not about the event of the plan.
Well, and I will say, I think from my end, the biggest thing that shifted just when I project back to like how I had these conversations in the first couple of years of my career versus how those conversations go now. I think if there's one fundamental thing that's changed is early on, I literally talked a lot more about the projections, right? Like the math of here's what you project out to be, and like we're on track, or we have enough or not enough or more than enough, or you need to save this much. And just like, it was very much about the numbers of that projection, how they were shaping up, and then sort of the classic, like, but we're going to, we'll do fresh projections for you on an ongoing basis because, life may turn out a little bit differently than this. And so, we'll continue to project again in the future.
Let me ask real quick, in that conversation early on, were you using confidence intervals too? Like
yes, that was so
7%.
Yeah. I mean, at least my spiel for it was very Monte Carlo based, because it was at least a thing already by then. First generation of it, that a lot of those conversations were Monte Carlo based, because my spiel, even at the time, this is like 2003 or something, was talking about like, look, there's a lot of different ways this can happen in the future. I don't know which one is going to happen in the future. I've done an analysis that includes thousands of different possible scenarios, and we're actually looking at how likely it is for this particular outcome to occur. And, you have a 97% chance that, we're going to do at least as well as what you need to do to achieve your goals. And because we're going to be updating this on an ongoing basis, if we start going down the path of the other 3%, like, we're going to have a conversation before you get there. And so I will admit, at least for me, just the coming at it from sort of the Monte Carlo probabilistic basis, because my thing always started with, well, I got to explain a little bit of Monte Carlo, and I just kind of had to like, it's kind of like flipping a coin. We put it through 1,000 times. We look at all of these different scenarios. That it was very much built around a story of, it's a world of many, many possibilities. I have no idea which of the possibilities is going to happen. I can tell you overall how likely it is that your path is going to be the one.
You were saying those words in the beginning? I have no idea which.
Yeah.
So you're not saying that's an evolution. You're saying in the beginning you were like,
because at least for me, that was how I learned to describe and explain Monte Carlos. I mean, just the whole nature of it was like, it generated 1,000 different possible market scenarios. Some of them are even worse than anything we've ever seen, because that's actually what happens if you run 1,000 trials in Monte Carlo. Like, some of these are worse than everything we've ever seen. I don't know which of these is going to turn out to be the one. What I do know is that about 97% of them turn out to at least cover all of your goals. So, we would view that as having you very well on track for your goals, because we'll make, we'll do updates over time. And if it turns out the other 3% is happening, we'll have that conversation when the time comes.
Yeah, no, I love that. See, but that to me is another way of saying, hey, we're going to be a little less wrong over time. And I'm not suggesting you'd say that to clients. I'm simply, I do. I think it's totally fine. But But the way you're saying it, it's not even that we're using different tools. It's the way we present it. And I've watched this sort of false sense of precision that's crept in. You know, when we start using sophisticated tools that were designed for atomic bombs, and we all desire certainty because it's a human trait, and we want a little physics MV, and we've got all this evidence-based stuff going through the industry, right? And we forget that it's a complex adaptive environment.
Yep.
That in the end, we're not sure, and you're using language like that as you described it. Like, I'm not sure which one of these. That's much different than I'm 97.23% confident that you're going to meet your goals. That's a different discussion. And so, we've talked about this before. I want to make sure we don't miss the point. Here's this young financial planner who's struggling with what I think a lot of us struggle with. The fear of being wrong.
Yeah.
Right? The fear of the plan not working out, the fear of having a map that they need to defend. How did you again, you strike me as somebody who cares about being right.
Oh yeah, I very much so. I like
deal with that. How did you deal with knowing? So change 97 to 72. How did you deal with knowing that there's at least a non-zero chance?
So I remember this client case very well. So we'll call them the Smiths. Obviously they weren't. We'll call them the Smiths. So the Smiths were a like very high spending lifestyle. They were actually involved in the investment industry. They had made a huge amount of money. It was like an low eight figure portfolio. They spent hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, which was like well within a 4% withdrawal rate for them. If we're like going back to that world, like there was a lot of money moving around. That still wasn't enough for them. So they had a $400,000 lifestyle, but they wanted like a $600,000 lifestyle on their $12 or $15 million portfolio or something. And so, and they were fairly young. They'd gotten to this point, and I think back then they were probably in their late 40s. So this is like, spending $600,000 on $12 million with a 50-year retirement projection, which at least at the time when you plugged all that through a Monte Carlo engine, they were a 60% probability of success. And so I came into the meeting, like all the mental preparation for like, how are we going to tell people who have a $50,000 a month lifestyle that they need to rein it in a little when they've got $12 million that's growing? And we start going through the plan, and we kind of get to the there's a 60% probability of success with your plan, the way that you're spending. So they said, so you're telling me that there's only a 40% chance that we would need to cut our spending? I'm like, well, yeah, there's only a 60% chance. I mean, everything else we're putting out the door is, 95 to 97%. So we're like, you have a, virtual veritable disaster. We're presenting you this train wreck of a 60% probability of success plan. And the first thing Mr. Smith says was, so you're saying there's a 40% chance we will there's only a 40% chance we would need to cut our spending. Like, well, yeah. I said, well, great. We're going to keep living our lifestyle. And if we start going down that path, call us and we'll change. But if you're telling me that there is a 60% chance we don't need to change a blessed thing and there will be money left over, we're going to go live our lifestyle.
That's so awesome.
And they were that was how they went. Like they went forth from there. And it actually worked out fine, because this was probably like 2003, 2004. So markets were very, very good in the mid 2000s, and they quickly got ahead of their original projections. So as far as I know, they're still doing fine that path. I've been in touch with them for a very long time. But like in this world of like, we've done so much work to analyze your plan and figure out the adjustments that your probability of success is some like 90+% thing, right? The first thing to him was like, so there's only a 40% chance that we would have to cut our spending.
Yeah, so good.
They were totally flexible. And obviously some clients, like any spending cut is a personal catastrophe. So like you can't run that level of cavalier, but they totally had very, very flexible spending. Like they knew they spent extravagantly.
Yeah.
They were fine with it. Like, okay, if we start going down the bad path, we'll make changes.
Yeah.
And if we don't, we won't. And like in essence, what was going on for them that I really only came to appreciate even like many years after that is we tend to start with you got a 97% or a 92 or whatever it is. We've got our thresholds, different firms have different thresholds of like, when is it great? When is it okay? And when is it so low that you're like, oh, I got to rein the client in off of this because we're on a near disaster path. And for pretty much every firm I've ever talked to and known, 60% is lower than pretty much anyone's threshold to be comfortable as a advice professional, because you're doing the math in your head of like, how much do I get sued if the 40% happens and they go bankrupt? But their world was still like, Mr. Smith got it better than I did. Because I was in a world of there's only two outcomes, the 60% good or the 40% bad.
Right.
And he had a completely different framework, which is if we start down the 40% path, we will cut our spending. And if we don't go down the 40% path, we won't cut our spending. So I was living in this like black and white world. There's going to be a success or a failure, and I'm terrified it's going to be a failure on my watch. And Mr. Smith was already like many steps ahead in the if then what if scenario formulations that I couldn't even do in the plan. Mr. Smith's plan was essentially, we're going to spend here, and if the market falls 30%, we're going to cut our spending.
Yeah,
which I actually couldn't even do in the planning software. Like you can't say cut client spending, but only if the portfolio goes down by this much. A few tools are now just starting to do that. Right, Capital just launched a thing, but historically, like we couldn't do that in our planning software. So I only had you're 60% in the green or 40% in the red. Mr. Smith was already doing his own what if scenarios and knew that he had enough flexibility in his plan. And so they went off happily down the road of their 60% Monte Carlo, which I think is a version of this, right? Was like so fixated on oh my gosh, I can't send a client out there that has a 40% chance of destitution, because it's bad for them and it's my fault and it's on my watch and I'm getting sued, or I'm just gonna feel off, like all those negative things that we start piling on. Yeah. And he was just like, look, I got $12 million. If it's going that badly, I'm gonna see it coming. I'm just gonna cut my spending. It's okay.
Yeah, I love that story. That's really great. Like, I think what makes me think of that is like, we are in the end, we're helping people make really important decisions with incomplete information. Like there's no way to have the information about what's going to happen for the next 3, 5, 10 years. We're going to do our best. We got some really sophisticated tools to model it. Everybody's happy. Like we're better than this. We're better at this than anyone else in the world. Great. But what we do when we're navigating a complex adaptive environment like a client scenario is we've got to have a strong opinion. And here, that's what I think was so cool. Mr. Smith, like, strong opinion is, I'm going to keep spending this way. And then you actively, and that's what I think my financial planner friend, I tried to emphasize to her was, instead of you actively look for so you create a hypothesis. 60/40 is just a hypothesis backed up by some really cool modeling tools. And then you actively look for disconfirming evidence. You're on the lookout for disconfirming evidence. And instead of feeling like, oh no, disconfirming evidence showed up, we're sort of actively looking for it. We're not looking for confirmation bias. We're just actively looking for disconfirming evidence. And then and I think more likely when disconfirming evidence shows up and our hypothesis turns out to be slightly not true one way or the other, it could be, as you pointed out, a good piece of disconfirming evidence, could be a negative, then we know, like, okay, cool, we've got these powerful tools to adjust. And so if you can get that, to me, it's like a mindset shift where we start to understand, like, disconfirming evidence isn't bad. Yep. We're not wrong And when I say wrong, I don't mean like, wrong. You keep using the word lawsuit. I don't mean like bad wrong. I mean like math problem. You got an incorrect answer. You don't have any fancy feelings about an incorrect answer. It's just an incorrect answer. So
Well,
I think making that switch is really challenging for us, because that's what we do, is we're helping people navigate irreducible uncertainty. There's no way to get that right all the time.
To me at least, that like the word you said at the end really is the distinction, and you know, maybe it's nuance and we're parsing language, but I'll admit, just like I do have kind of this visceral like, you're right, like damn it, my model wasn't wrong, like don't
Sure.
wrong my model.
Yeah.
But so to me, there's a difference between being wrong and the mere fact that there is an uncertainty
Sure.
around. There is as you said, like there is an irreducible uncertainty. And to me, I guess that's part of why frameworks like Monte Carlo worked well, or worked better, at least for me, in having those conversations, because it started with the point of there's a whole bunch of different future market scenarios. I don't know which one it's going to be.
Yeah.
So I just analyze all the possibilities, and we'll talk about the range of outcomes and
plus a bunch that have never happened, right?
Right. Plus a bunch that never happens. Like we're modeling even more uncertainty than you ever seen in the world, because literally how the math works. Right. And so like, to me, that's where it started. And so, there is no right or wrong in that projection, right? Like Mr. Smith was not going to be right if they landed in the 60% and wrong if they landed in the 40%. I don't even know whether they were going to land in the 60 or the 40 zone. They didn't know. The only difference was I was afraid they were going to land in the 40, and they didn't care, because they just said, if we start moving towards the 40, we're just going to steer right on back out of it. And I do think there's an aspect that it's very easy when we start doing those projections to get stuck on that projection. I know you like to call it, like, we get stuck defending this map of what the future was supposed to be, and then it gets really hard when the future doesn't turn out that way. That the more, at least to me, like the more we embrace, no, there really are a range of outcomes, and I don't know what the outcome is going to be. I'm here to help you make the adjustments along the way for whatever path we go down.
Yeah.
Gets us to a better place. Like, it reminds me, I know Matthew Jarvis these days is talking a lot about their guardrails framework, which they pulled from the Guyton research years ago, of like, look, we're just going to try to keep clients in I don't know what their numbers are, but between a 4% and a 6% withdrawal rate. As long as you're within the guardrails, you're fine. If you drift out of the guardrails, you're going to make an adjustment. Now, I don't know if you're going to hit the good guardrail, the bad guardrail, if you're going to totally cruise down the middle of the lane and hit no guardrails. What I know is we've got a plan about what happens if you deviate out of the guardrails, and a plan of what you do if you stay in the guardrails. And so I'm just here to go with you and execute the plan. Yeah. I don't know what it's going to be, but I know that whatever scenario comes, we have, in sort of the most literal sense, a plan.
Right.
Here's how we will respond if these things happen, and here's how we respond if those things happen. And then we're going to find out what they are. I do think we have a challenge, particularly just in our planning software world, where our tools aren't built to show that. I mean, literally, I think Matthew made his guardrails in an Excel spreadsheet, because financial planning software that's built to do all this stuff basically can't show that relatively simple, straightforward thing on an ongoing monitoring basis. Yeah. So I do think our tools kind of set us up for this sort of problematic defend the wrong map that never turns out that way, because it's not going to be $2.713 million in 47.2 years. But where you come out for that, like where Mr. Smith went, where Jarvis is ultimately gone, is, well, you just have some parameters in place. I mean, to me, just in the most literal sense of the word, you have a plan. Yeah. A plan is if X, then Y. Like, that's a plan.
Exactly right.
When you have that plan, you literally have a plan. Like, I don't know what the future is going to be. I know we have a plan about what we're going to do. And I think the gap, at least like where my thinking has changed on it from when I used to have these conversations early on, is when I had them early on, I mean, I would talk about, like, Monte Carlo, lots of trials, uncertainty. I don't know what the future's going to hold, but it basically always ended with, And that's why we do updates with you every year, and why you have to keep working with us on an ongoing basis, because we're gonna always be here to carry you through it. And like, that was fine for us. It was very, frankly, it was very self-serving, because like, you have to always have us here because we have to do the updated projections every year to see what's going on. But we never got to the next step, which was actually doing what Mr. Smith had already done, which was, well, if my portfolio falls below this, I'm just going to cut my spending. And if it doesn't, I won't. And we didn't come with the plan. We just came with the, we'll monitor and figure things out as they go. And I think that was a shortfall of the planning process for us. I don't think it was nearly as satisfying for clients as really having, I'll call like the plan, which is, if this, then that, if this other thing, then that other thing. And I think we don't often get to that part. And when we don't, then we get stuck kind of living in the wrong.
Yeah, no, I think, look, there's a couple things that are really important. One is, if Mr. Smith got to keep spending, that doesn't make you wrong. If you had to cut back on Mr. Smith's spending, that doesn't make Mr. Smith or you wrong. It means it's just, that's like what the thing is. Like, it's a factual situation on the ground that needs to be dealt with. There doesn't need to be a bunch of fancy feelings. That's why I get so fired up about the idea of being a guide instead of a defender of a map, because a defender of a map has all sorts of fancy feelings: shame, blame, I'm wrong, you're right, sue, like all those words that you've used. A guide says, look, a storm blew in. We've spent lots of time in the mountains. We know storms blow in. We have contingency plans. That's what we call them. And in fact, we even talked about it in our first meeting. We said, if this happened, we talked about it. Would you like to die sooner? Would you like to spend less? Would you like to save more? Like, we have all these levers.
Yep.
We talked through which one you'd prefer. Mr. Smith, you told us you'd prefer to cut spending a bit. Guess what? The storm blew in. We don't have to have any fancy feelings, nothing. We just cut your spending. That's what we talked about, right? Like, I think what's the problem is, my young financial planner friend who's a bit paralyzed, and all these other conversations I've had about this, is we've misinterpreted what the job is to live in that world that you just described. Yes, we'll have contingency plans. Yes, we're going to draw the best, most precise plan we can ever have. And we know that when it doesn't work out, we're going to be looking for disconfirming evidence. When it shows up, we already have a plan.
Yep.
And we know it will show up. Like, the easy one for me is like when the market's down 30%. Like, when a client's call, it's scary. Like, it's scary for them. It's scary for us. You and I have talked about this ad nauseum. But when it happens, we knew that was going to happen.
Yep.
We didn't know when. It's in the data, but it's still scary. And so you have to realize that that's like, it's not about figuring out a way that you can prevent being quote unquote wrong. And I'm using that word just like in a technical definition. I don't mean like weighted, just incorrect. Your job is not to figure out how to be incorrect. Your job is to recognize that there will be variability, and you have to look people in the face and help them make decisions in irreducible uncertainty. After all the amazing work you have done to reduce the uncertainty, there's still a pile of it. And the pile of it exists within a set of bands, depending on the kind of work you've done. So you've narrowed the bands of it. There's still uncertainty in those bands. And your job is no amount of work, thought, carefulness, big calculators, giant abacuses will get rid of that uncertainty. It's still going to be there. And so then if we can flip the switch to realize, like, no, actually, that's what I get paid for.
Right.
Is when that stuff shows up, to be the calm head, to help navigate, to pull the plan off the shelf and go, oh yeah, that's right, Mr. Smith, we talked about this. I've got you. Don't worry. All we have to do is cut your, I mean, remember those 2009 discussions where people would come in, like the retired couple living off a pension, and they would think it's the end of the world. And we would say, could you go without your cost of living increase for a year or two? And they would be like, what? That's all? Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
Like, we already had that in the plan. Like, we already knew, could you just skip your cost of living increase until further notice, maybe 2 or 3 years? What, that's it? Yeah, that's it.
Yep.
Right? Because we already knew. So I think that's, to me, is the answer to this worry we have about being precisely correct, is do the work, do everything you can to be as precisely correct as you can, and have a plan when the irreducible uncertainty surely will show up, right? And live in that space, which I think leads us to another discussion we should have another time, which is what does that mean for our training?
Yeah.
Like, what do we do to live in that space of what I like to call wrongness? And I'm using air quotes there because I don't want you to feel like, oh, bad. Like,
Thank you. I appreciate that.
That's a slightly different version of this job when you start to realize resilience, calm, confidence, like those are important pieces of the job. Yeah. So that's super fun. Do you think we answered the question? I don't know if we did.
I think so. I think so. I mean, again, to me, like it's because then I have to think of this in the most nerdy of terms, right? Like the classic retirement projection is, just that like that line of wealth and how it's supposed to build over time. For those who can't see, I'm like drawing with my hands up and to the right, right? And we get very focused on where that line ends, and does it end high enough, or does it end positive and not negative, or does it have a margin for safety so that in case they live longer? Like we tend to project that line. And to me, I think the biggest takeaway in the shift is it's less about drawing the line, and it's more about where you draw the guardrails around that line. The line is a projection that's never going to turn out to be precisely right.
Right.
Perfect. The guardrails you draw around that line are what keep it from ever getting so far off track that a disaster occurs. Yeah. And the important part is not where the line goes. The important part is actually where the guardrails go. Yeah. And that's still a function of tools and projections and Monte Carlo. And like, there's lots of ways to define those guardrails the same way that we historically defined the line. But I think like the biggest distinction to me is the line is always wrong. The guardrails are the plan. The guardrails are really the part that actually matters, not where the line is projecting. And like that to me is the shift. At least that makes sense in my head. I'm like drawing it with my hands for all those listening on a podcast. But like that's the distinction, like because the guardrails shouldn't be off. The guardrails almost by definition should be what keep you from going too far off the road and really getting in a ditch and getting in trouble.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think it'd be fun. Maybe we can tease this a little bit. We should talk about different versions of guardrails, because I have a favorite version that I haven't seen. And I think the spending policy 4 to 6% or 3 to 6%, like all of those, and I think that's really, really true. And having a conversation around what levers are like these are lifeboat drills. What levers are you going to pull when you bump up against the guardrails? Because we've got more than one lever. It's not just asset allocation. It's not just risk and reward. There's 5 or 6 levers. So I think that's the important stuff. So if you've ever been worried about like a little bit paralyzed because you're heavily analytical and you're super smart and you've got powerful tools and just realize like it's not. One quick last story. I've got a friend who runs a sort of distressed company, private equity firm. And he was yesterday telling me like, Carl, I got 2 calls yesterday from companies who are like, let's just call him Sean. He's like, Sean, we're going 100 miles into a brick wall. We've got about 14 days. Ooh. His job for 30 years. And
wow.
Has been to step into those scenarios. And what he always says is, look, we got to make really important decisions with incomplete information.
Yeah.
There's no way we're going to be right, but we got to decide today.
Yeah.
And I think that's a version of where we live, right? Like, so know that you can't, no matter how smart you are, know how powerful your tools are, you can't get rid of the irreducible uncertainty. Yeah. So you can make these guardrails and these plans to deal with them. And then some of the other podcasts we've done on making yourself harder to kill and more resilient, that stuff becomes more and more important because you now accept that that's part of the job. So I guess that does it. Thanks, Michael.
All right. Awesome. Thank you, Carl.
Amen. See you later.
Amen.